Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together some of the UK's leading commentators, UK specialists and the foreign correspondents filing and blogging to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, embarrassment for Boris Johnson over who originally paid for his wallpaper, but does it really deserve the days of headline coverage devoted to it? And the world rallies to India's aid, but is it too late to halt the virus's deadly course? Joining us to discuss those questions, Ashish Ray, Indian foreign correspondent who's reported from London since the 1970s. Steve Richards, UK political commentator who's even turned his journalism into a successful stage performance. And here in the studio with me, Lise Doucette, a Canadian whose passports must be thick with immigration stamps by now, having reported from so many parts of the world. No wonder she's our chief international correspondent. Lovely to see you again, Lise. And good to have you with us again, Steve and Ashish. Now, when in London, British Prime Ministers live over the shop, as it were. Boris Johnson, his partner and their young son occupy an upstairs flat in Downing Street. For the entire week, the news media here has been transfixed by this question. Who originally paid for it to be refurbished to the Prime Ministerial family's taste? Though Mr Johnson says he's paid for it, his coyness over the alleged involvement of his Conservative Party and perhaps one of its donors has now prompted an official investigation into a possible breach of election law. Steve, there may be people watching this programme who think, I don't really care who paid for Boris Johnson's refurbishment, provided it's not me.
Yeah, and there is evidence in Vox Pops around the country with elections in Britain scheduled for next week, where that is a view. I think it's a misguided view for several reasons. First of all, it's not so much about the detail as the principle, whether a prime minister should comply with rules outlined to some extent constrain and hold prime ministers to account as to who funds what. And it's also part of a pattern where Boris Johnson appears to be, if I can put it politely, more casual with the rules than many of his predecessors. And that applies on a much bigger stage, threatening to break international law, found to have broken the law over proroguing Parliament. But I mean, there are questions of integrity, but very briefly, I mean, they're obvious and common. I think it raises issues about judgment and trust. Who a prime minister trusts when people are leaking all over the place, including apparently or allegedly some in number 10 who work for him. What does it say about his judgment that he appoints Dominic Cummings to the most powerful place in his government? And he now apparently is accusing him of being not just a liar, but a deranged liar. So it raises many deeper issues beyond his taste for wallpaper. And it probably isn't his taste, it is his fiance's taste. And that, I think, raises another issue about the nature of that relationship, which he's never talked about publicly. He doesn't have to. But now that is being drawn into it, and he'll hate that because he doesn't like talking about his personal life. So for many reasons, there's a lot of talk in Britain of voters. It has no cut through with voters, but it will affect the mood of number 10 and the government and Johnson's leadership in quite profound ways, I think.
And one way or another, Ashish Ray, it's an extraordinary distraction because it seems to be consuming, all right, the media can report whatever stories they like and it doesn't matter if it's consuming a lot of their time, but it's consuming the time of the Prime Minister. The Cabinet Secretary is the most senior official in government. Cabinet Ministers desperately trying to find forms of words that don't look like a commentary on it and avoid answering questions on it. Parliament, the opposition seems obsessed by it. And lots of other, frankly, arguably much more important things the government should be focused on.
You're absolutely right. You said that I've been a foreign correspondent in this country since the 1970s, which is indeed true. I came here when James Callaghan was Prime Minister. And I can say this much, that no Prime Minister in my memory has been under so much pressure as Boris Johnson has been in the past 1 week for his personal conduct. And this is serious because now the Electoral Commission has taken up the matter, is going to investigate it, and it sees reasonable grounds for an offence or offences having occurred. Now, that's a very serious statement from the Electoral Commission. And this story, whether it impacts on the local elections and the mayoral elections on the 6th of May or not, is probably not going to go away so easily. And it could have a medium-term impact, if not a long-term impact. And therefore, I think there should be reason for concern in the Conservative Party, because it's the party that's now under attack, because the investigation will look into the party's conduct as well and can penalize the party if any wrongdoing has been discovered. And that said, this may not be the only inquiry, because the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner may look into the matter as well.
Lisa, Ashish, as you said, has been based here. This is now, I think, the eighth Prime Minister. Then, if my maths is right, that he's reported on from London. You travel internationally constantly, or at least normally, COVID aside, you travel constantly. How do you think this compares with the treatment of political leaders? I know he's not the head of state, but nonetheless, the most important politician in our country. With other countries, how would it look internationally, do you think?
Well, I think even domestically, when you get up in the morning and you hear the news, you read in the paper and it's all about curtains and sofas and wallpaper, and when there are huge issues, but Steve mentioned the T word, which is trust, but the other one is transparency. Do we really know what really happened? And is this a microcosm of where we're not getting the full story, not just about Boris Johnson, but about the Conservative Party and politics in general? So I think it's emblematic of something wider, if you like. But certainly internationally, 10 Downing Street is not just a property, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of British power, British status, British, the whole aura, if you like.
That and black door with the silver lettering.
It's known, if you say 10 Downing Street anywhere, almost anywhere in the world, people know. So I think people do find it odd that the Prime Minister, to use your expression, lives above the flat. And, obviously when I travel, I've interviewed many world leaders, and they live sometimes in palatial and sometimes actually literally palaces. And sometimes it's surreal, because I've often noticed that sometimes in the countries which are falling apart, they still have the bone china and the curtains and the lovely chin sofas, everything properly in its place, even though outside it's complete pandemonium. But I've never, ever heard people discussing the cost of curtains, you hear about renovations, but not in this way, and certainly not connecting the leaders. So is this really symptomatic of the politics we live in, where nothing is beyond the pale, where, especially with social media, especially with really divisive and fractured politics, that these sorts of issues are fair game, if you like?
Ashish, I wonder, given the detachment you enjoy by being an outsider looking in for many years, and you mentioned Jim Callaghan, who I think most people would say was a kind of, regardless of his party politics, was a model of rectitude on things like this, and would probably be the kind of old-fashioned politician who'd be quite appalled with people discussing things like sofas and curtains when there's so many big issues. Do you think one solution to this might be just to start paying our prime ministers properly?
Well, I think that's an argument which can be debated. It can be tossed about in Parliament, for instance. But the sum that the Prime Minister draws is not inconsiderable. And so if he is out of pocket for any reason, then there must be something to it. Obviously, he earned a lot more money writing for the Telegraph and also doing lectures, including India, where he was very handsomely paid once for a lecture not so long ago in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, his income has come down, but he also has, even while being Prime Minister, income from royalty from his books. He's got 2 properties from where he's got rental income. So it's adding up, really, and it's not as if he's living in poverty. But in this case, it's a matter of principle. I am reminded of a case more than 20 years ago, and a lot of you may remember this, which is of Peter Mandelson having to step down as Secretary of State because he had borrowed money from a fellow MP and a fellow minister called Geoffrey Robinson. The actual loan that was given to Mandelson to buy a house in London took place or was given to him before the Labour Party came into government in 1997. But since the matter came to light while he was Secretary of State, he had to step down. So that was certainly the standard which was applied. And therefore, in this case, whether the original money came from a loan or a grant, I think that's bad enough, because we all know that people, businessmen in particular, don't lend or give aid unless there's something in return. And that's where it gets really murky. And to get so murky at the level of Prime Minister is, to me, a little disturbing.
And that's the question. Obviously, we don't know the details of. The Prime Minister still says, look, I've paid for it. And as far as he's concerned, that's the end of the subject. I mean, Steve Richards, this may not imminently bring Boris Johnson's career to an end, but is there a possibility that this will shorten the amount of time he has left in Downing Street, do you think?
It depends what happens with the opinion polls. I think it could anyway, if he finds it all just too hellish in the coming months. But that apart, he has this protective shield of opinion poll leads. And while they're in place, colleagues, while viewing him, I think, privately with some wariness these days, and in fact all the way through, won't move against him because he still seems to be a vote winner. If that changes, he's on a really slippery slope. But I would just contextualise this for a moment. There's a slight myth in Britain that sleaze alone can bring down prime ministers, and John Major is cited. Other factors have to play into it as well. So there has to be a voter perception of, say, economic incompetence, as there was with Major when they fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. There has to be a dynamic alternative, as there was seemingly in the mid-90s with Tony Blair and New Labour. So there have to be other factors for it to have that sort of fatal impact, and sleaze then plays into it. Sleaze alone, there's a sort of pattern where voters turn away. And actually, you mentioned Callaghan, Harold Wilson before Callaghan had a lot of sleaze allegations and won 4 elections out of 5. So there need to be other issues whirling around as well. Now, with this vaccine rollout being very successful in Britain, that doesn't apply at the moment, but it might well do when the economic consequences of the pandemic are addressed, along with all the other chaotic things going on in number 10, incidentally, including Brexit. So other factors might also come into play.
So we'll soon find out in the local elections then
Yes,
what the people think, because it'll be a barometer, if you like. Is this really just in the political classes, as important as it is? As Ashley said, there's 3, possibly 4 investigations, so there must be something serious in this. But, you know, the sun is shining. Britain has one of the most successful vaccine rollouts in the world. We are hearing there's going to be an economic revival. How are people going to vote? Are they going to vote? But how are they going to vote? And does this really matter to the British public in the same way that it matters to, well, our conversation today and to the pundits and parliamentarians?
As you say, and we'll be discussing that, of course, on next weekend's edition of Dateline. Steve mentioned that Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan's predecessor. If you want to know what all that's about, just go onto your internet search engine after the programme, if you don't mind, onto the internet search engine. Just type in Ganax raincoat, G-A-N-A-X, and see what comes up. Now, journalism is rapidly running out of words descriptive enough to capture the scale and horror of the COVID crisis gripping India. As the world's second most populous country, it's no surprise that the number of people who've contracted the virus is measured in millions, or the number of deaths in hundreds of thousands, almost every day recently. And yet again, on Friday, the number of infections has reached a record high. Yet measured as a percentage of the population, India's fatality rate is relatively low, much lower, say, than that of the United States or Britain. Actually, so I was looking at the figures on one of the sites, the Johns Hopkins University site, and they've got India down at 14.5 people per 100,000 in terms of mortality rate. US is 175. Even the UK is 191, slightly worse than the US because we were hit particularly bad in the first wave. How credible are these mortality figures, do you think, in the light of the international comparison?
Well, as you very rightly said, the official figures point to fatalities in India not being at the level of what has occurred in, let's say, the United Kingdom or the United States. And we're talking about percentage of the population. But I would venture to say and this is expert opinion which has come from the medical fraternity, it has come from eyewitness accounts, it has come from what I would call circumstantial evidence, the figures do not appear to be correct. And this is not merely pertaining to this year, but also last year. What's being said is that right at this moment, the figures are way below what is reality. And that being the case, I think there is reason to worry. I don't know whether India in percentage terms will go past other countries, but for the moment, it's a very grim situation. If you take an aerial view of Delhi, it would appear as if there's been a bombing raid over the city, because fires are burning everywhere. Fires are burning in car parks, they are burning in public parks, they are burning in back gardens of residences. These are all funeral pyres because the crematoriums simply cannot cope. It's a devastating scene, and that, I think, tells you how serious the story is. The government is at its wits' end, and India, which has a very good team of doctors nationwide, does not have infrastructure. And this is a Modi-made crisis because he had 1 year to prepare for this second wave, but he didn't. He declared victory over the winter. He told the World Economic Forum that he saved humanity, and yet this was always a possibility. And so when it struck, he and India were completely unprepared.
Lisa, it's interesting, isn't it? Because as Ashish says there was a year, a kind of a grace period almost. Some clearly in government thought, well, the worst is over, we got vaccination, that solves the problem. In a sense, it reminds us, first of all, vaccination on its own is not enough, even if you can roll it out. India's had some problems with that. But I was noticing The Economist reporting this weekend that one official in the tribal area of Nandurbar, which is in northern Maharashtra, had used the year. He doesn't have a lot of money, but he'd spent his budget on things like ensuring that all the hospitals could generate their own oxygen. There are people who've thought ahead. Not all the officials have been sitting on their hands waiting for something to happen or waiting for political direction from above. But that, in a sense, makes the government's performance in this look even worse, doesn't it?
As always, when you see a crisis of these sort of proportions, it's in these most inhumane of moments. You see these moments of shining humanity. You mentioned this person who took it upon himself to prepare, but every time we see an absolutely heartbreaking report from New Delhi or from Mumbai or from another part of India, there's also the heartwarming stories about how local people are coming together with whatever means they have. You have the local businessmen collecting oxygen canisters. You have the big businessman with his providing a helicopter to fly people to places where there are hospital beds available in IC units. So Indians are pulling together. And I have to say, is it because there's such a large community here in Britain with South Asian ancestry, or is it because of the scale of the crisis? But every journalist, and I don't know whether Stephen Ash is the same, but every time you hear a journalist reporting from India, they say, they also have a personal note. They say, I've lost a friend. I've lost a family. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is check who I've lost that's close to me. And the BBC's, we have a wonderful team, a strong team in India doing fantastic reporting. But you can see they're also worried about their friends, their family. They're worried about themselves. And the number of, on social media, people saying, my friend does anyone know where I can get an oxygen canister? Does anyone know where there's a bed? The social media is pulsating with the passion and the fear and the cries for help.
And it's a reminder, Steve, isn't it, that this is one of the situations in which social media really earns its spurs and justifies the amount of attention and resources and money that are thrown into it, why it really matters. It is life and death for many communities.
Yeah, no, social media is in many ways an enabler and does empower people at a local level, not least in a crisis where there has been a kind of leadership vacuum. I mean, it is odd that India escaped early on, but it has engendered this complacency at the top. And the lack of that national leadership, the lack of smart ways and networks to distribute, especially the vaccine, has led to this sort of panic-stricken dependency on goodwill and local communities acting in this way. But it is desperate. I mean, I find it unwatchable. And that image just evoked of a sort of the equivalent of a bomb hitting Delhi is unbearable to contemplate. The worry, of course, is that although social media can mean that people can communicate and coordinate, the power to resolve and to instruct remains with leaders, as we know from our experiences here. And that has been lacking with terrible consequences.
Ashish, you mentioned Boris Johnson, and we've said on balance the scandal in inverted commas about the refurbishment may not have much political impact on his prospects of remaining Prime Minister. But this is a real scandal, and it is one that's costing thousands of lives on a weekly basis. Do you think there will be a significant political backlash against Mr. Modi, notwithstanding the kindness of strangers being to help people in a crisis, whether the anger of voters will actually be demonstrated against the BJP in coming months?
Well, at the moment, there's deep and rising anger, but it's too early to tell whether it will lead to Modi having to step down. At the moment, he's done everything wrong. For instance, India, as you know, has a company called Serum Institute, which is the biggest manufacturer of vaccines in the world. And Serum Institute had acquired the license from Oxford to manufacture the Oxford vaccine. And what did Modi do? Modi asked Serum Institute to export the vaccine to other countries to win brownie points rather than give vaccines to his own people. Today, with this crisis and with people panic-stricken, there's a shortage of vaccines. And therefore, what Britain has achieved by way of vaccinating people and creating this safe, relatively safe and feel-good factor, situation and feel-good factor, that simply does not exist in India at the moment, because India has a very, very long way to go before it can vaccinate adequately its people. It's still below 15% of the population in terms of the first dose only. So you can imagine at what scale the problem has escalated in just a few weeks.
And indeed, the chances then of averting the path of this are very, very remote at this stage. Let me end the programme by asking each of you in turn just a very brief question. Is there a story or something perhaps we have neither given much attention to, given all our obsession with wallpaper and rightly with the crisis in India, that perhaps has got a bit neglected? Steve, is there anything that you've noticed you'd like to mark our audience's cards about?
Yeah, but remember, the obsession isn't with wallpaper; it's with rules and propriety.
Quite right.
But yeah, the Joe Biden speech this week, which was a sort of radical argument for the state and spending to boost the economy, was really interesting, because he has been described as a centrist, but he's always actually been a radical. He was the one who lifted the Neil Kinnock speech about 1,000 generations of Kinnock and the advance of the state as an enabler. And I think it's very interesting that in Britain, people like George Osborne and David Cameron were described as centrists. But in the US, you have someone perceived as that, who is actually doing a lot in terms of using the state as a benevolent force. And the poll suggests it's popular.
Good. Ashish?
Well, I think from a British perspective, I'm very, very surprised that not just now, but for several weeks, British media have ignored a story in India. This concerns a Briton. His name is Christian Michel, who's been in prison in India for over, nearly 2.5 years without a trial. He's accused of having paid bribes in a helicopter deal some 10 years ago, and there does not appear to be a credible charge against him. Yet he is in the most hazardous of conditions in a Delhi jail. And in this COVID situation, I think the danger to him is even greater. But the point of the matter is that even if he is an accused, and even if he needs to go on trial at some point, you cannot hold a person indefinitely for 2.5 years. I'm really shocked that British media have not picked up this story so far. Very little coverage has taken place. As it happens, one of the stories that I did was for a British paper on this very matter. This was because the United Nations has slammed India on this matter and asked India to release Christian Michel immediately.
And haven't heard from the British government. Ashish, thank you very much. Very briefly, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, I have to talk history because my colleagues have been bringing up history, history in the air in Afghanistan. 20 years after NATO forces, where US-led NATO forces went in, they are now pulling out, Britain as well, to a very uncertain future for Afghanistan. It's not really on the news radar now, but Afghans are really, really worried. America's ending its longest war, but the war's not over for Afghans.
Lisa Doucette, Ashish Ray and Steve Richards, thank you all as ever very much. Thank you too for being with us on Dateline London. Back at the same time next weekend. Goodbye.